When the Panorama program threatened in 1995 to erupt into an enormous scandal, key people at the BBC had to make a crucial ethical choice. Do we cover things up, or do we come clean? The person who had taken the rap for the scandal, pretty much all of it, is the hoaxer, Martin Bashir. If this were a cowboy movie, he would be wearing a black hat, the blackest hat of all, to signify his villainy. Bashir's boss, the man who was running the BBC at the time, Lord Burt, has said, unless you understand that this was a serial liar on the industrial scale, you simply cannot understand the story. In 100 years of BBC journalism, can we think of anyone else who has behaved in that kind of way? But though Bashir is a villain, he's not an interesting villain. His motivation is plain. The people who might have explained to Diana that she had been the victim of a hoax, who might have stopped the runaway train that Bashir had set in motion, were what William calls the leaders at the BBC. And so the concern of this book is to consider their likely motivation. Were they all truly taken in like Diana by the man in the black hat? Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Dear Denise. Today is the day, my friends. We're going to be reading Dianarama. And this book is a detailed story of how Diana was manipulated and tricked into giving that explosive interview in 1995 to Martin Bashir on the BBC. This book is also the account of how the BBC tried to cover up for Martin Bashir. Martin Bashir was a horrific manipulator and had been known to be deceptive and who was not functioning at the highest levels of ethics. So for me, I'm shocked that they would allow a person who was so slimy to come within 10 miles of royalty. But he managed it, and he managed it by tricking and hoaxing Diana into believing that all of her paranoia and all of her fears of conspiracy were true, and that she needed to come and scream out at the rooftops, and he would give her that opportunity to save herself. Come out and tell us who's really against you, Don't let them trick you. Don't let them take you down silently. Come out and let the world know that they're after you. And by tricking and deceiving and giving her false documents, she really needed very little convincing because she was already very fearful of this. And now to have somebody at the levels of the BBC saying, this is such a dramatic situation, we will give you our BBC platform to save yourself. She took the bait and she had this explosive interview, and Martin Bashir, as he did with Michael Jackson, destroyed her. But what is really important about this book is not just what Martin Bashir did, but what the BBC did to cover for Martin Bashir. And so today we're going to be reading the introduction and the prologue to kind of set up the story and the author's intentions for why he wrote this book and what he plans on exposing in this incredibly lurid and fantastical story. It is, as he says, a Shakespearean plot if ever there was one. It is wild. And he is not telling you that to get you excited about the book so that you'll turn the next page. Like, it is a wild story of deception, deceit, trickery. It's horrifying. It's horrifying that this is really what went down. And Diana, who was already incredibly paranoid, was brought to new and lower levels because this guy just wanted a story. He fed into her delusions. He fed into her fear. And he made somebody whose life was already a misery that much more torturous because he said, "You're right." And then he went on to destroy her in the process. So today we'll be reading the introduction, getting ourselves acclimated to what the point of the book is. And then tomorrow we'll start in on part 1, which is entitled Mindset. And that's where we're going to be really looking into where were the main players emotionally and mentally. Where was Princess Diana coming from with this paranoia? Because it wasn't unfounded. She had legitimate reasons for fear. And so this book's going to kind of catalog where she was coming up with these conspiracies. And quite frankly, I think many of us in her same position, even people amongst us who are not conspiracy minded, would have thought something's not right here and people are after me. I don't see how a person could have come to any other conclusion. We also need to figure out where was Charles in all of this. Where was he mentally? Where was he emotionally? And you'll recall that he himself had his own explosive interview in which he had come out and discussed his friendship with Camilla. And so he's in a bad place as well. So nobody is on the highest levels of emotional and mental wellness here. So we need to talk about that before we can even get into what a snake Bashir was. But I am telling you, this is so interesting. I love the way the author lays out the groundwork for us, lays out the backstory for us. It's incredibly interesting, full of tidbits, full of like pieces fitting together that you're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. It's very, very, very well written. A lot of information quickly. So this is definitely like a listen closely. And it's another reason why I wasn't willing to do a recap on this book, because it's just so chock full of tidbits and interesting stories and important ways that small things fit together that I knew I would forget things. If I were to read this book and then come and sit in front of the camera with you and just tell you the story, I would leave out important things. So I'm really excited about doing this read along, and I hope that you'll enjoy it with me. Let's get into it. The prologue is entitled What Saddens Me Most. On an overcast spring day 4 years ago, Prince William looked straight into the TV camera at all of us and said,
"It brings indescribable sadness to know that the BBC's failures contributed significantly to her fear, paranoia, and isolation that I remember from those final years with her."
He was speaking, of course, of his mother Diana and reflecting on the report which had been published that day, May 20th, 2021, dealing with the biggest scandal in BBC history. It had been promised that this document, the Dyson Report, would reveal after an inquiry lasting 6 months how the BBC had hoaxed Princess Diana into appearing on the Panorama program on November 20th, 1995. The interview which Diana gave reporter Martin Bashir was damning of the royal family, and especially William's father. In fact, so damaging that in less than a year Diana had been stripped of her royal status and, newly untethered, was dead once another year had passed. What William said next was startling.
But what saddens me most is that if the BBC had properly investigated the complaints and concerns first raised in 1995, my mother would have known that she had been deceived. She was failed not just by a rogue reporter, but by leaders at the BBC who looked the other way rather than asking the tough questions.
It is those words which tell us that what happened to Princess Diana 30 years ago is still a matter of burning intensity for her son. Because here William goes considerably beyond the verdict of the inquiry report, which looks at the conduct of those leaders of the BBC and decides that they were not guilty. They were, in William's judgment, not hapless and blameless stooges plagued by ill fortune. Instead, they looked the other way. When the Panorama program threatened in 1995 to erupt into an enormous scandal, key people at the BBC had to make a crucial ethical choice. Do we cover things up, or do we come clean? The person who had taken the rap for the scandal, pretty much all of it, is the hoaxer, Martin Bashir. If this were a cowboy movie, he would be wearing a black hat, the blackest hat of all, to signify his villainy. Bashir's boss, the man who was running the BBC at the time, Lord Burt, has said, unless you understand that this was a serial liar on the industrial scale, you simply cannot understand the story. In 100 years of BBC journalism, can we think of anyone else who has behaved in that kind of way? But though Bashir is a villain, he's not an interesting villain. The people who might have explained to Diana that she had been the victim of a hoax, who might have stopped the runaway train that Bashir had set in motion, were what William calls the leaders at the BBC. And so the concern of this book is to consider their likely motivation. Were they all truly taken in like Diana by the man in the black hat? Lord Dyson's report, though compiled at a cost of more than £1 million, does not tell us how Bashir hoaxed Diana. It says simply that in the autumn of 1995, Diana was bursting to have her say on TV, and that Bashir, a charming rogue, was lucky to catch her at the right time. Dyson says that when, the following year, BBC bosses looked into what Bashir had done, they bumbled and they baffed and they failed to get an answer, yet nobody can be blamed for their failure. Lord Dyson does not tell us how the BBC then covered up the scandal for 25 years, nor who was in charge of the cover-up. And the malign effect of Dyson's report is more serious than even these omissions about what happened long ago. It is in 2025 being used by the BBC as both a deterrent to further inquiry and as a shield by those people who, as William put it, looked the other way. This book will present evidence to answer the questions which the inquiry ought to have settled but did not, and it will also explain William's most poignant words, what saddens me most. Consider the sadness of this man whose life has been shaped by what the BBC did to his mother. How William, as a 13-year-old schoolboy, had to watch Diana talk of sex with a lover, then trash his father on television. On television, on the BBC! The news that Diana and Charles would divorce followed exactly 1 month after the Panorama interview. For a youngster desperately hoping, as kids do, that Mum and Dad would fall back in love, that'll have been heartbreaking. The effect of learning that this wrecking ball set swinging by the BBC might have been grabbed, and should have been grabbed, before Diana died is beyond imagining. The story of Diana's life between autumn 1995 and her death 2 years later will also be of enduring historical interest, And so this book may serve, I hope, as at least a first draft of history. I sometimes think that even 30 years on, we're still too close to those surreal-sounding events to properly see how bizarre the circumstances remain. Can it really be true that the woman who was supposed to now be our Queen Diana, had been assured by the BBC that her husband was a potential killer? Did she, because of that assurance, really set off on the crazy strategy described later in this book merely to keep herself alive? The answer to both questions is yes. And it is a story more lurid, more fantastical than anything that happened at the Tudor court of Henry VIII, which so fascinates historians today. Indeed, Diana's last 2 years sound rather like a twisted Shakespearean plot, written as soap opera. A beautiful princess is betrayed by a heartless husband, pining for his own lost love. A character saddles up, whispers sinister warnings of murder and betrayal, but our heroine cannot see that she's being duped by a worm-tongued villain. Cast out, her own destiny now linked with a feckless ne'er-do-well, only a tragic death awaits them both. It is Shakespearean, but it's horribly true, a story which will be picked over by historians and retold for centuries. For that reason alone, it's a story which deserves to be told in a way that is more complete than the Dyson Report, a document studded with omissions and marked by its apparent failure, in at least one case, to grasp the importance of critical evidence. I believe that insomuch as the report has established a temporary orthodoxy, it will be rapidly dismantled by historical researchers. But consider right away that the Panorama interview, the most controversial broadcast ever made by the BBC, is not at all what you think it is. It is in reality not an interview, but a performance, a double act, devised, rehearsed, and delivered with a specific object in mind. There was a quite separate interview, carried out 7 days earlier, but which has passed under the radar. That is the important encounter, the one which reveals the truth about these extraordinary times. Many journalists have looked at the Bashir scandal over the last 30 years, and I can say without being too swell-headed that something I did 5 years ago, described later in this book, finally brought it to light. I've studied these matters for something close to 20 years, and have confidence in my judgment because it is made, I believe, from a unique position. As you will see, I had been able to obtain formally secret documents despite enormous opposition from the BBC. And at the same time, I have had close inside access to those who knew Diana best at this critical moment in her life, especially her brother Charles Spencer. He has shared with me his archive showing how he tried and failed to get the BBC to admit what they had done to his sister. As you will also see, as the story unfolds, the revelations I was able to make have had a profoundly personal effect on many people who are shabbily treated by the BBC. Some are handed hundreds of thousands of pounds in reparations. For others, the knowledge of the BBC's duplicity has at least provided some comfort in explaining why Diana behaved as recklessly as she did, harming not just herself, but those she loved. Prince William's speech of May 2021 can be regarded as a victim impact statement, which, it seems to me, might have caused Lord Dyson to think a little deeper had it been delivered, as usually happens, before sentence was delivered rather than after. William concludes with a sentence which is itself remarkable when the implications are fully considered. The BBC, perhaps the world's most respected journalistic enterprise, one that should be shouting loud for truth and honesty, instead worked furtively to prevent people like me covering the BBC's misdeeds. As William put it,
"These failings, identified by investigative journalists, not only let my mother down and my family down, they let the public down too."
Now, I could tell you, after having even read just a few of the opening chapters, this business here about how this story is more lurid and more fantastical than anything that happened to the Tudor court and that it's a Shakespearean plot is not an overstatement from the author just to grab your attention. This is an intensely interesting book, and also really maddening and saddening, because it's wild to me that at the highest levels of the BBC, they would allow somebody like Martin Bashir to get his claws in somebody of such significance like Princess Diana. Like, it seems to me that you would not allow this clown of giant proportions to approach somebody like Diana, because the ramifications of his screw-up would be enormous. This is a person who had a history of being untrustworthy from the beginning. This isn't a person who they found out after the fact was not always minding his P's and Q's. The introduction is entitled The Million-Pound Question. In June 2024, I did something I had not done for 30 years. I drove to a nearby shopping mall, went into what used to be called a gentleman's outfitter, and I bought a dark suit, a white shirt, and the most sober tie I could see. It felt like choosing kit for a sports event, or, more exactly, determining my look for a gladiatorial bout. Swords and shields here, nets and tridents across the aisle. At the very least, it would prove that I was serious about my upcoming 2 days in court, and I needed to grasp every small advantage I could. My summons to court came 3 years after I had used the Freedom of Information Act to put to the BBC a very simple question, but a question which it turned out people there were determined not to answer. And I mean really determined. The issue would come to occupy not only the most highly paid lawyers inside New Broadcasting House, but also the most expensive lawyers from London's elite legal chambers. People who charge upward of £5,000 per day. As my request was repeatedly denied for those 3 years, I had been forced to run a solo guerrilla campaign for my kitchen table. I had to become my own lawyer, trying to match the constantly shifting legal maneuvers of the pros being paid to my intense annoyance, by me, from my BBC license fee. And the BBC would clearly spend whatever it took to make sure I did not win this case when it finally came to court. The BBC's bill just for external legal fees would come to a staggering £646,694. In all, considering likely internal costs as well, something well over £1 million. So what was this £1 million question? One which required such extraordinary legal might to prevent it being answered. The question was simple. The circumstances which prompted it a little more complicated. Looking back from our viewpoint today, 30 years on, it's clear that the BBC managed to cover up the worst elements of the scandal concerning their infamous Panorama interview with Princess Diana in November 1995. It is now clear beyond doubt that Martin Bashir used forged documents to get his foot in the door, to gain his first introduction to Diana 6 weeks before the interview took place. But these facts did not emerge until 2020. As described in more detail later, it was only when I was able to get a hold of a formerly secret document from the BBC, after a 13-year struggle, that the scandal burst into the open, and Bashir's duplicity was revealed for the first time. Fully 25 years had elapsed from the moment the BBC cover-up was first devised in 1995 to the point where it collapsed in ruins in 2020. It seemed to me that during that time certain BBC managers must have actively sought to keep matters secret for as long as they possibly could. And so, to test my theory, I had used the Freedom of Information Act to demand cites of emails which passed between the likeliest suspects at a critical period in 2020. If they had been trying to keep things under wraps, to sustain the cover-up, perhaps an incautious email would betray them. My question to the BBC, posed on June 4, 2021, said, I would like to request all documents that exist relating to email or other correspondence between BBC managers and the BBC Information Office between September 2020 and November 2020, which has any bearing on the November 1995 Panorama program with the Princess of Wales. It sounds simple enough. But what would happen over the next 3 years would involve the most astonishing twists and turns, the mysterious disappearance of certain documents, and the miraculous appearance of thousands more. The case would become, at least in the BBC's own estimation, the biggest freedom of information case there has ever been. And the weirdest, altogether hardest to believe moment came roughly halfway through, 18 months after I had made my initial request. The BBC had declared in a statement signed by one of its lawyers that the total number of emails relevant to my request was 80. 80. A short time later, a different BBC lawyer said, in effect, scratch that, the correct number is 3,288. 3,288! They had lost 3,208 emails, this lawyer said, through a computer error. Now, instead of a fistful of documents, it turned out that there were 10,336 pages, enough to fill 20 bulky lever arc folders, a page count equal to War and Peace 10 times over. And that, as you will see, provided just one of the tricky questions to be decided. How do more than 10,000 pages of documents go missing from one day to the next, especially ones which might implicate senior BBC managers in a cover-up? It was at 10 a.m. on Tuesday, June 18, 2024, that the court was scheduled to convene in a workaday modern building in London's Bloomsbury. The BBC had a legal team of 7, including a thoroughly terrified KC, the topmost case of lawyer, described on her own website as the silent assassin of cross-examination. But I did have my new suit. All right, so that's the setup for the book. And tomorrow we're going to start on part 1. Part 1 is entitled Mindset, and we need to figure out where everybody is standing before we can actually get into the interview. Why did everyone think that Princess Diana was a basket case? Was she acting like a basket case? And why was she acting like that? What did she believe was true about her life? What did she become convinced was her destiny? Did she believe people were after her? Why did she think people were after her? What circumstances in her life led her to the likely belief that people were after her and were looking for her demise? Did she have actual evidence, or was this just something that she had cooked up in her own mind? Her dramatics, her emotional inconsistencies, like, was this just a quirky personality, or had this poor girl been led to believe that there were people who were actively planning her demise and that her ex-husband was in on it? So we need to figure out why she was in such a vulnerable place when Martin Bashir came to her, and why she was willing to work with the snake in the grass. So that's all going to be coming tomorrow and in the coming days. We're going to be looking at all the key players: King Charles, Diana, and the institutions around them that she felt were working against her. And then we can get into Martin Bashir and the kind of person he was, and why we shouldn't be surprised at all that this guy took full advantage of somebody in such a vulnerable spot and used her fears and her paranoias against her. Because quite frankly, after we read exactly the way the world looked from Diana's perspective, it's not hard to see why she was fully convinced of a conspiracy against her. Her life was so abnormal as it was. What's one more abnormality? That these people would want to get rid of you, that these people would want to move you along so that they could go with the people that they wanted to go with, say Camilla. So it's not hard to imagine that she had worked herself up into a frenzy, because there were enough actual signs, there wasn't enough actual evidence, like leaked audio of her personal phone calls and people knowing intimate details about conversations that she'd had in private, where it would have been very easy to believe that you were being bugged and watched. And so I think it's really helpful to see what her perspective was. So that's what we're going to get into tomorrow and the following days. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me. I'm really, really excited about this read. I think it combines all the things that we love. We've got the royal family, we've got conspiracy, we've got like an actual crime having been committed. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. I hope this caught your attention, and I hope that you'll stay with me for all the episodes this month. And I will see you tomorrow. Bye.